All right, so let's get started with chapter 2 of To Kill a Mockingbird. Bill left us in early September to return to Meridian. We saw him off on the 5 o'clock bus, and I was miserable without him, until it occurred to me that I would be starting school in a week. I'd never looked forward more to anything in my life. Hours of wintertime had found me in the treehouse, looking over at the schoolyard, spying on multitudes of children through the 2-power telescope Jim had given me, learning their games, following Jim's red jacket through the wriggling circles of Blind Man's Bluff, secretly sharing their misfortunes and minor victories. I longed to join them. So let's jump back. This is a key event we're going to add in here. Okay, we're going to add this in here. Out starts school. Okay. Not only is this an important key event for the story, it's a big milestone in your life. Jim condescended to take me to school the first day, a job usually done by one's parents, but Atticus had said Jim would be delighted to show me where my room was. I think some money changed hands in this transaction, for as we trotted around the corner past the Radley place, I heard an unfamiliar jingle in Jim's pockets. When we slowed to a walk at the edge of the schoolyard, Jim was careful to explain that during school hours I was not to bother him. I was not to approach him with requests to enact a chapter of Tarzan and the Ant-Men, to embarrass him with references to his private life, or to tag along behind him at recess and noon. I was to stick with the first grade, and he would stick with the fifth. In short, I was to leave him alone. "You mean we can't play anymore?" I asked. "We'll do like we always do at home," he said. "But you'll see, school's different." It certainly was. Before the first morning was over, Miss Caroline Fisher, our teacher, hauled me up to the front of the room and patted the palm of my hand with a ruler and then made me stand in the corner until noon. Miss Caroline was no more than 21. She had bright auburn hair, pink cheeks, and wore crimson fingernail polish. She also wore high-heeled pumps and a red and white striped dress. She looked and smelled like a peppermint drop. She boarded across the street one door down from us in Miss Maudie Atkinson's upstairs front room, and when Miss Maudie introduced us to her, Jim was in a haze for days. Miss Caroline printed her name on the blackboard and said, "This says, I am Miss Caroline Fisher. I am from North Alabama, from Winston County." The class murmured apprehensively, should she prove to harbor her share of the peculiarities indigenous to the region. When Alabama had seceded from the Union on January 11th, 1861, Winston County seceded from Alabama, and every child in Macomb County knew it. Okay, so this is another reference to the Civil War. Winston County, where Miss Caroline's from, stayed with the North. They didn't secede to the Confederacy, so everybody is kind of distrustful of them. North Alabama was full of liquor interests, big mules, steel companies, Republicans, professors, and other persons of no background. And there's a lot to unpack here. So if you're unfamiliar with kind of the history of political parties in the United States, the Republicans, the party of Abraham Lincoln, were originally anti-slavery and a pretty liberal party. And that didn't change until about the 60s when Democrats and Republicans basically shifted positions. So they view Republicans as those northern progressives that you can't trust. And then here where it says there's persons of no background, remember that kind of feeds into that idea of the gentry South, the idea that you have to be from a fine old family, otherwise you can't be trusted. Miss Caroline began the day by reading us a story about cats. The cats had long conversations with one another. They wore cunning little clothes and lived in a warm house beneath the kitchen stove. By the time Mrs. Cat called the drugstore for an order of chocolate malted mice, the class was wriggling like a bucket full of catawba worms. So catawba worms, courtesy of me looking this up to make sure that I was right, they are a caterpillar that's particularly well known in the South because they are suggested to have magical powers as the greatest fish bait. So if you have a bucket full of catawba worms, this is probably a reference that they were all familiar with. Miss Caroline seemed unaware that the ragged, denim-shirted, and flour-sack-skirted first grade, most of whom had chopped cotton and fed hogs from the time they were able to walk, were immune to imaginative literature. Miss Caroline came to the end of the story and said, "Oh my, wasn't that nice?" Then she went to the blackboard and printed the alphabet in enormous square capitals, turned to the class and asked, "Does anybody know what these are?" Everybody did. Most of the first grade had failed it last year. I suppose she chose me because she knew my name. As I read the alphabet, a faint line appeared between her eyebrows, and after making me read most of My First Reader and stock market quotations from the Mobile Register aloud, she discovered that I was literate and looked at me with more than faint distaste. Miss Caroline told me to tell my father not to teach me any more. It would interfere with my reading. Teach me? I asked in surprise. He hasn't taught me anything, Miss Caroline. Atticus ain't got time to teach me anything, I added when Miss Caroline smiled and shook her head. Why, he's so tired at night he just sits in the living room and reads. If he didn't teach you, who did? Miss Caroline asked good naturedly. Somebody did. You weren't born reading the Mobile Register. Well, Jim said I was. He read in a book somewhere I was a bullfinch instead of a finch. Jim said my name's really Jean Louise Bullfinch, that I got swapped when I was born, and I'm really a. Miss Caroline apparently thought I was lying. Let's not let our imaginations run away with us, dear, she said. Now you tell your father not to teach you any more. It's best to begin reading with a fresh mind. You tell him I'll take over from here and try to undo the damage. Ma'am? Your father does not know how to teach. You can have a seat now. I mumbled that I was sorry and retired meditating upon my crime. I never deliberately learned to read, but somehow I had been wallowing illicitly in the daily papers. It was the long hours of church. Was it then that I learned? I could not remember not being able to read hymns. Now that I was compelled to think about it, reading was something that just came to me, as learning to fasten the seats of my union suit without looking around or to achieve two bows from the snarl of shoelaces. I cannot remember when the lines above Atticus's moving fingers separated into words, but I'd stared at them all the evenings in my memory, listening to the news of the day, bills to be enacted into laws, the diaries of Lorenzo Dow, anything Atticus happened to be reading when I crawled into his lap every night. Until I feared I would lose it, I never loved to read. One does not love breathing. I knew I had annoyed Miss Caroline, so I let well enough alone and stared out the window until recess when Jim cut me off from the covey of first graders in the schoolyard. He asked how I was getting along. I told him. If I didn't have to stay, I'd leave. Jim, that damn lady says Atticus has been teaching me to read, and for him to stop it. Don't worry, Scout, Jim comforted me. Our teacher says Miss Caroline's introducing a new way of teaching. She learned about it in college. It'll be in all the grades soon. You don't have to learn much out of books that way. It's like if you want to know about cows, you go milk one, see? Yeah, Jim, but I don't want to study cows. Sure you do. You have to know about cows. They're a big part of life in Macomb County. I contented myself with asking Jim if he'd lost his mind. I'm just trying to tell you the new way they're teaching the first grade, stubborn. It's the Dewey Decimal System. Now, just as a pause, I will mention that as a teacher, this is entirely accurate. Every couple of years, we come up with new ideas and new ways to try to teach, and sometimes they don't always work. The Dewey Decimal System was a great idea that they had to try to standardize education, to try to make sure that everybody was learning the same thing. So if you were from one school, you didn't learn differently if you transferred to another school. But it didn't always work the way that we imagined that it would. So this is still something that happens today. Having never questioned Jim's pronouncements, I saw no reason to begin now. The Dewey Decimal System consisted in part of Miss Caroline waving cards on us, which were printed with the, cat, rat, man, and you. No comment seemed to be expected of us, and the class received these impressionistic revelations in silence. I was bored, so I began a letter to Dill. Miss Caroline caught me writing and told me to tell my father to stop teaching me. Besides, she said, we don't write in the first grade, we print. You won't learn to write until you're in third grade. So it's a little bit confusing, especially if you're from the north, but here we would say you print your name, but they're using writing to mean in cursive. So, which is how Scout is writing. Calpurnia was to blame for this. It kept me from driving her crazy on rainy days, I guess. She would set me a writing task by scrawling the alphabet firmly across the top of a tablet and then copying out a chapter of the Bible beneath. If I reproduced her penmanship satisfactorily, she rewarded me with an open-faced sandwich of bread and butter and sugar. In Calpurnia's teaching, there was no sentimentality. I seldom pleased her, and she seldom rewarded me. Everybody who goes home to lunch, hold up your hands, said Miss Caroline, breaking into my new grudge against Calpurnia. It occurs to me that this is probably a good time for us to jump back here and add this into our notes. Scout does not get along with her teacher, Miss Caroline. There we go. The town children did so, and she looked us over. Everybody who brings his lunch, put it up on top of his desk. Molasses buckets appeared from nowhere, and the ceiling danced with metallic light. Miss Caroline walked up and down the rows, peering and poking into lunch containers, wondering if the contents pleased her, frowning a little at others. She stopped at Walter Cunningham's desk. "Where's yours?" she asked. Walter Cunningham's face told everybody in the first grade he had hookworms. His absence of shoes told us how he got them. People caught hookworms going barefooted in barnyards and hog wallows. If Walter had owned any shoes, he would have worn them that first day of school and then discarded them until midwinter. He did have on a clean shirt and neatly mended overalls. "Did you forget your lunch this morning?" asked Miss Caroline. Walter looked straight ahead. I saw a muscle jump in his skinny jaw. "Did you forget it this morning?" asked Miss Caroline. Walter's jaw twitched again. "Yes'm," he finally mumbled. Miss Caroline went to her desk and opened her purse. "Here's a quarter," she said to Walter. "Go and eat downtown today. You can pay me back tomorrow." Walter shook his head. "No, thank you, ma'am," he drawled softly. Impatience crept into Miss Caroline's voice. "Here, Walter, come and get it." Walter shook his head again. When Walter shook his head a third time, someone whispered, "Go on and tell her, Scap." I turned around and saw most of the town people and the entire bus delegation looking at me. Miss Caroline and I had conferred twice already, and they were looking at me in the innocent assurance that familiarity breeds understanding. I rose graciously on Walter's behalf. Uh, Miss Caroline? What is it, Jean Louise?" "Miss Caroline, he's a Cunningham." I sat back down. "What, Jean Louise?" I thought I had made things sufficiently clear. It was clear enough to the rest of us. Walter Cunningham was sitting there lying his head off. He didn't forget his lunch. He didn't have any. He had none today, nor would he have any tomorrow or the next day. He had probably never seen 3 quarters together at the same time in his life. I tried again. "Walter's one of the Cunninghams, Miss Caroline." "I beg your pardon, Jean Louise." "That's okay, ma'am. You get to know all the county folks after a while. The Cunninghams never took anything they can't pay back. No church baskets and no script stamps. They never took anything off anybody. They get along on what they have. They don't have much, but they get along on it." My special knowledge of the Cunningham tribe, one branch that is, was gained from events of last winter. Walter's father was one of Atticus's clients. After a dreary conversation in our living room one night about his entailment, before Mr. Cunningham left, he said, "Mr. Finch, I don't know when I'll ever be able to pay you." So, an entailment, as much as I've been able to find on this, is kind of a non-specific way of saying that somebody isn't in full control of their property. Now, whether that's from a lien or an inheritance argument or somebody arguing over property rights, we don't really know. So this is kind of open as to what they're actually talking about. "Let that be the least of your worries, Walter," Atticus said. When I asked Jim what an entailment was, and Jim described it as a condition of having your tail in a crack, I asked Atticus if Mr. Cunningham would ever pay us. "Not in money," Atticus said, "but before the year's out, all have been paid. You watch." We watched. One morning, Jim and I found a load of stovewood in the backyard. Later, a sack of hickory nuts appeared on the back steps. Holly. With Christmas came a crate of smilax and holly. That spring, when we found a croaker sack full of turnip greens, Atticus said Mr. Cunningham had more than paid him. Okay, now this is a word that I'm not familiar with. I'm familiar with most of these things. Smilax, however, that's a different one. So let's look that one up. Here we go. So we can see Smilax. Excellent. So it looks kind of similar to holly, especially with those red berries, which makes it probably, the red and green combination makes it probably pretty well known around Christmas time. "Why does he pay like that?" I asked. Because that's the only way he can pay me. He has no money. Are we poor, Atticus? Atticus nodded. We are indeed. Jim's nose wrinkled. Are we as poor as the Cunninghams? Not exactly. The Cunninghams are country folk, farmers, and the crash hit them the hardest. So again, we have the crash. So that's a reference there to the Great Depression and the stock market crash. Atticus said professional people were poor because the farmers were poor. As Macomb County was farm country, nickels and dimes were hard to come by for doctors and dentists and lawyers. Entailment was only a part of Mr. Cunningham's vexations. Ah, so here is a great vocabulary word. So let's pull that one up. Vex. Make someone feel annoyed, frustrated, or worried. Annoy or worry. There we go. The acres not entailed were mortgaged to the hilt, and a little cash he made went to interest. If he held his mouth right, Mr. Cunningham could get a WPA job, but his lands would go to ruin if he left it, and he was willing to go hungry to keep his land and vote as he pleased. So here we have another mention that's very kind of casual and thrown away, but it is super important, especially when we look to the civil rights era. So at this time, the only way that you could get to vote is if you were a white landowner. The white part is kind of jammed in there because realistically, if you weren't white, you probably weren't going to be able to own property to begin with. So just to mention, he doesn't want to risk losing his land, otherwise, he loses the right to vote. Mr. Cunningham, said Atticus, came from a set breed of man. As the Cunninghams had no money to pay a lawyer, they simply paid us with what they had. Did you know, said Atticus, that Dr. Reynolds works the same way? He charges some folks a bushel of potatoes for delivery of a baby. Miss Scout, if you'll give me your attention, I'll tell you what entailment is. Chim's definitions are very nearly accurate sometimes. If I could have explained these things to Miss Caroline, I would have saved myself some inconvenience and Miss Caroline's subsequent mortification. Okay. If you're unfamiliar with that, let's find that one out. So to mortify, we have our French word mort, meaning death. So let's see if mortify has the same thing. To cause someone to feel embarrassed, ashamed, or humiliated. So there we have kind of that idea that you're so embarrassed you could just die. Let's add that to our vocabulary. But it was beyond my ability to explain things as well to Atticus, so I said, You're shaming him, Miss Caroline. Walter hasn't got a quarter at home to bring you, and you can't use any stove wood. Miss Caroline stood stock still and then grabbed me by the collar and hauled me back to her desk. Jean Louise, I've had about enough of you this morning, she said. You're starting off on the wrong foot in every way, my dear. Hold out your hand. I thought she was going to spit in it, which was the only reason anybody in Macomb held out his hand. It was a time honored method of sealing oral contracts. So that's a reference to a spit shake. Wondering what bargain we had made, I turned to the class for an answer, but the class looked back to me in puzzlement. Miss Caroline picked up her ruler, gave half a dozen quick little pats, and then told me to stand in the corner. A storm of laughter broke loose when it finally occurred to the class that Miss Caroline had whipped me. So they're used to the knuckles across the ruler across the knuckle method of punishment, and Miss Caroline's kind of taking it really lightly on them. She doesn't know how she's supposed to do it. As an antiquated system of punishment we don't really use, at least in schools anymore, because it doesn't work. It just teaches kids to hate school. But they're kind of laughing because Miss Caroline's a pushover. When Miss Caroline threatened it with a similar fate, the first grade exploded again, becoming cold sober only when the shadow of Miss Blount fell over them. Miss Blount, a native Macomian, as yet uninitiated in the mysteries of the decimal system, appeared at the door, hands on hips, and announced, If I hear another sound from this room, I'll burn up everyone in it. Miss Caroline, the sixth grade cannot concentrate on the pyramids for all this racket. So we have the angry Miss Trunchbull character here. My sojourn in the corner was a short one. Okay. Let's add that word onto our vocabulary list. Sojourn. So a temporary stay. Saved by the bell, Miss Caroline watched the class file out for lunch. As I was the last to leave, I saw her sink down into her chair and bury her head in her arms. Had her conduct been a little more friendly toward me, I would have felt sorry for her. She was a pretty little thing. Okay. So I love the way this chapter ended because it's funny. I've definitely had days like that. I think every teacher has had days like that where at the end of it, you just go set your head on your desk and you're just, oh, God, why isn't anything working? So this is funny. I can definitely empathize with Miss Caroline here. We're going to go ahead and end chapter 2. We'll continue with chapter 3 next.